Good morning and welcome. For those of you that I have not met yet, my name is Marissa Shera, and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Fairbanks Chamber of Commerce. The Fairbanks Chamber is a business advocacy organization that works to advocate, promote, and develop our community, and we are powered by our membership. Before we get started today, I'm going to go ahead and announce the winner of the 50-50 drawing. I don't know what the pot is because I forgot to ask Alex, how much do we have today? $161 goes to lucky number 464-0740. 0740. Did you leave already? We didn't even get started. Going once. 0740, going twice. Oh man. The second luckiest person in the room is 464-0912. Yes, that's the sound I like to hear. What's your name and who are you with today? Perfect, thank you. At the Fairbanks Chamber, we advocate for and work toward the best possible environment for businesses, both big and small, to survive and thrive in the Greater Fairbanks area. We promote our region and our communities by creating awareness that drives economic strength and growth for interior Alaska. And we develop the informational resources and a networking hub where enterprising people can advocacy. We work to affect policy that creates an ideal environment for businesses of all sizes to prosper in our region while promoting those businesses throughout the community and fostering the development of resources that position the Chamber as a hub of information and connections. The Chamber is confident that we will find success by keeping those goals in balance, and our community will thrive when we capitalize on the intersections between them. Our advocacy efforts focus on a breadth of topics, including natural resource development, energy, military, workforce development, transportation, healthcare, and community and economic development. Our first priority in 2019 is the support of a long-term fiscal plan for the state of Alaska. Our position lines out 6 important points that we urge our elected leaders and our state policymakers to consider. The Fairbanks Chamber supports utilizing earnings from the permanent fund as a source of revenue for the general fund that allows both reasonable dividends to be paid and funding of desired state services. In that vein, we also support establishing a formula and putting it into statute that will allocate those earnings amongst government services, PFD payments, and inflation proofing. The Chamber opposes dividend payments for back years at this time. The Chamber supports, at a minimum, funding for our university at a level that was consistent with last year, recognizing that UAF is a significant economic driver in our community in terms of jobs, feeding our local talent pipeline, and increasing Arctic research opportunities, and so much more. UA has worked through a strategic plan for the last 4 years that has resulted in methodical and significant cuts to spending and reductions of jobs. We believe that Alaska must have a long-term view for our future and plan beyond the current budget gaps. In order to create jobs for Alaskans, the legislature must focus on ways to encourage private investors in all sectors to bring Alaska's oil, minerals, and timber into production and diversify employment opportunities within our state. We believe that the cost and structure of our government must be revised so that services are provided more efficiently, lower priority programs can be eliminated, regulatory redundancies can be repealed, and statutes and formulas that direct funding should be reviewed. And we believe that capital projects that leverage federal dollars should be prioritized. We believe that as a state, we should continue to put downward pressure on state expenditures, and as appropriate, and now is not the time for new taxes, though we recognize that there might be a time when implementing a broad-based tax would be appropriate. And finally, our position calls for a safe landing approach. To solve our budget issues, which means cutting expenses gradually and increasing revenues each year by broadening the economy through developing and maintaining a strong business environment. This approach will minimize negative effects on the economy and reduce the risk for job losses. We believe that the proposed budget not only creates negative impacts, but it will result in a drastic reduction of our entire economy. Cumulative local impacts of the budget as proposed include more than 1,000 expected job losses in our community, which compounds the stresses on our current healthcare system. It increases the burden on our local taxpayers, and there are many more unintended consequences. With that said, on behalf of the Fairbanks Chamber, our board of directors, our committees, our staff, and our members, we appreciate this opportunity for Governor Dunleavy and his team to be with us today to discuss the budget as proposed and to also discuss the constitutional amendments. So thank you so much for being with us today. This is the first time that Governor Dunleavy, post-election, has been with us here at the Chamber, so I'm going to take a moment to formally introduce him. Governor Dunleavy arrived in Alaska in 1983 as a young man looking for opportunity, and he found it. His first job was working at a logging camp in Southeast Alaska. Later on, Governor Dunleavy pursued his dream of becoming a teacher. He earned his teacher's certificate and then a Master of Education degree from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He spent nearly 2 decades in the Northwest Arctic community working as a teacher, a principal, and superintendent. Governor Dunleavy's wife, Rose, is from the Kobuk River Valley community of Norvik. Together, they have 3 children, Maggie, Catherine, and Seal, who were raised in both rural and urban Alaska. Governor Dunleavy and his wife moved to Wasilla in 2004, where he worked on a number of projects to improve education, including a statewide mentoring project to recruit and retain excellent teachers. Dunleavy served on the Matsu Borough School Board and for 2 years was the board president, and then was a state senator for 5 years. The Dunleavys enjoy spending time together as a family, often in Alaska's great outdoors. Hunting, fishing, snow machining, and camping are all favorite activities. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Governor Dunleavy.
Thank you. Thank you. That was quite the introduction. I was learning more about myself as you went through that. I also learned a lot about the Chamber. It's very interesting, and if we can get a copy of the priorities of the Chamber, that would be great, because I think there's a lot of things that were laid out there that many of us agree on. So I want to introduce the staff I have with me. Bruce Tangeman is the Commissioner of Revenue. Donna Ardwin is our OMB Director. And then our Attorney General is Kevin Clarkson. And they're going to be helping out when we go through the slides here. So we have a slide deck that kind of lays out the history of the spending of the state of Alaska, where we've been, where we think we are now, where we would like to go. And in the end, I think we all agree that we want a healthier Alaska fiscally. We want an Alaska that's open for investment, getting a lot of investment, and growing jobs, growing the economy. That's the end goal here. The question is how do we get there? The last 4 years, under the previous governor, Governor Walker, he inherited a crash in oil prices. There's no doubt about it. I think it went down to about $29 a barrel, $26 to $29 a barrel in February of his first term. And so the state of Alaska has been grappling with this issue on how do you deal with depressed revenues. And of course, we know part of the reason for that is production is about 525,000 barrels. We've leveled off. And we've got oil prices today, I think, somewhere in the high 60s. But nonetheless, we still have a persistent gap that we're going to talk about. So the question is, how do you deal with it? Do you deal with it through using the permanent fund dividend? Because we already use half of the earnings. We already use a portion of the earnings. And that started last year for the first time in history. And I've always been an advocate of using a portion of the earnings. Where I question is whether we take the entire PFD. And I think that's where we're headed. We're going to show you why we think that's where we're headed. The issue of taxes is also has come up. You know, what kind of taxes? And I'll have conversations with people when they say, please tax me. Initially, I think that's an interesting request, but nonetheless, I ask them what kind of tax. You want a sales tax? You want an income tax? And they'll say yes. And I'll say, at what rate? What are the exemptions? What's the scale? What does this look like? And once you get into the details, oftentimes the conversation changes because they'll say they don't know, and that's part of the issue. And so we'll talk a little bit about taxes too, and what the tax burden would be on Alaska to close this gap. And then, of course, there's reductions. And this approach that we've taken, no doubt, is heavy in reductions. keeps the PFD at this stage of the game harmless, and tries not to tax Alaskans. So really this is about a conversation that began 4 years ago under Governor Walker. How do we close this persistent, it's a structural gap. It's a structural gap that will persist. Some folks believe that if we were to close that gap this year with a permanent fund or a tax at $1.6 billion, we have it solved. The issue is, and we're going to talk about this too, is the incline of spend is the issue. Our incline of spend at about 4.5% a year is probably too much for the economy to catch up to, because our economy is in recession, has been in recession for 4 years. It's the longest recession in the state's history. I came up in 1983 to Alaska. I was out in rural Alaska when oil crashed in the 80s. And for those of us that were here, we didn't know what to expect. We didn't know what was going to happen. Even though production was still ramping up, there was a lot of concern that Alaska may never be the state that we had hoped it would be, that things would fall apart. We all remember, we all read about banks failing and folks putting their keys on the table of the banks or in the mailbox and walking away. That recession lasted 2 years. That recession was shorter than the one we're in now. And the world didn't end. We got through it. We restructured Alaska in some sense. The economy became a little more diversified. And then we went through a period of, worth showing on the slides in a second here, a period of many years in which we did okay at spending at about 2.5% a year. So I'm going to hop over here with the microphone. We'll start going through a graph. The first graph, I think, is kind of lays it out. Where we were, where we're going to go, and what we got to work on. So, and I think you should have a bunch of these at the tables, and it's something I think you may want to hang on to. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Here we go. Can you hear me? Oh, somebody's helping me somewhere. Okay, thank you. So this first graph that we have kind of lays out the revenue picture, which is red, and then the spending picture, which is blue, called expenditures. So we all know, because Fairbanks was the epicenter for the pipeline, building the pipeline in the mid and late 70s, we came into, prior to the pipeline, we came into a $900 million lease on the slope. We all remember that, big headline, $900 million. The budgets previous to that were about $150 to $175 billion a year for the state of Alaska. Today, to some extent, that's a rounding error. I hate to say that, but nonetheless. Our budget today, what did we say it was, Bruce and Donna?
5.7.
5.7 billion, as opposed to 170 to 200 million back then. Nonetheless, we came into the leases, $900 million, and within a few short years, we were doubling and tripling our budgets. This appalled the people of Alaska at that time. For those that were here, you remember this. It appalled the people, it concerned Governor Hammond, and it concerned many in the legislature. As a result of that, we went to the people of Alaska and we formed a permanent fund. I think it was in 1977, to try and save money from the spending that people were concerned about for future generations. So back then, there was concern about spending. We also formed the constitutional, within a 10 to 12 year period, we formed the Constitutional Budget Reserve. We also formed, put in the Constitution the appropriation limit that we'll talk about here in just a moment as well. But nonetheless, we come into the $900 million, oil starts to pump, and all of a sudden the price goes up. I think in 1980, 81, it hit $31 a barrel, $32 a barrel, maybe 82. And production was increasing. We wouldn't hit peak production until 1989, 1990, 2 million barrels a day. So things were booming. We were getting all excited about the future of Alaska. I mean, the possibilities were endless. Then 86 comes. What happens in 86? It crashes, right? We had $9 barrel oil. We didn't know what to do. It was quite an experience. I was out in rural Alaska teaching, and I remember our administrators coming in and saying, we are going to have to tighten our belts. We're going to lose staff. We're going to lose travel. There's going to be programs that we can't continue to do. And we managed to get through that. Again, that recession lasted 2 years. And then things kind of leveled out for a while. These, some people refer to this as the boring years, the non-exciting years. But nonetheless, you know, we had oil somewhere that's sometimes at $19 a barrel, $15 a barrel, 26. When we hit $26 a barrel, I can remember this, people were saying, well, things are going to be great. That's $26 a barrel back then. In any event, our spending
matched pretty close to our revenues. And this is about, growth-wise, is about 2.5% a year during this entire time. The economy slowly diversified. We recovered from '86, and things were looking good. We were losing production slowly at this time, but nonetheless, Alaska was in pretty good shape with regard to the government. Can we go to the next, please? Now, before I talk about this, do you remember the bumper sticker? Please, God, give us another Prudhoe Bay, and Prudhoe Bay, we promise not to. Okay, that was prior to God giving us another quick Prudhoe Bay. That bumper sticker came out. So nonetheless, we start to see an increase in oil prices. I was here in Fairbanks, I remember this, getting diesel on July 5th, I think it was 2009, and diesel hit $5 a gallon because oil was at about $153, $154 a barrel. And we were just raking in the money at that time. So, you know, what we should have done, obviously, is if we maintained this 2.5%, we could have banked this amount of money here. Let's keep going to the next part of this here. This delta, and you'll see this on the next page, or another slide in the slide deck, but this delta, if we just kept it at 2.5% a year, this delta right here represents $29 billion in wealth. $29 billion in wealth that's gone. That Prudhoe Bay, that other Prudhoe Bay, that opportunity is gone. And what do I mean by opportunities? That $29 billion, if we dealt with it a different way, could have provided free electricity for all Alaskans probably for eternity. You could have had things like a Wantana Dam built. You could have had things like a electrical line, a direct current line from the slope providing just cheap, zero cost electricity if we put that $29 billion into something like that. You could have had 14 Anchorage-sized ports all over the state of Alaska, a railroad to Alberta. We could have paid off our pension obligations, our bonds. There's a whole host of things we could have done. But we didn't do that. Now, we saved some of this money in the CBR, and we're going to talk about this. So $29 billion was spent during that time above this 2.5% spend. And all of a sudden, in Governor Walker's first year, oil, once again, the price crashes. The issue was that production was not going to save us because production was down in the $550,000 barrel range. So we lost price, and the production wasn't there like it was in the late '80s to save us. So this is the issue that we're dealing with right now, this persistent structural gap. We have spending at this level. We have revenues roughly at this level. And the thing that I want to, before we leave this slide, I'd like you to take note of is last year when we were running out of money, the legislature increased the budget. So instead of continuing downward pressure, there was an uptick last year with more money put in, more money that I would say we didn't necessarily have. Can you go to the next slide? This is just another representation of representing that delta, that $29 billion. And this talks about the appropriation limits. So we do have an appropriation limit in the Constitution. It was put in by the people, and I believe in '81 and reaffirmed in a vote in '86. The problem with that appropriation limit was the formulas and the baseline was too high when it was set. So technically speaking, we've never punched through that ceiling, and we would have to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $9 billion, $8 to $9 billion to punch through that. We're advocating a constitutional amendment, we'll talk about that in more detail, that kind of keeps us into that traditional spend of 2.5% a year to hem us in, so that if we do, and I think we will, and we'll talk about this here in a moment too, I think we will get more investment. I think we'll see more oil production. And I think there's some tremendous opportunities for other types of industries that come to Alaska that we'll talk about here in a second. But nonetheless, we could have saved that delta. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, that $29 billion, and applied it to some of the things that we just mentioned. Next slide. So if we had that spending limit in place, let's go to this side here. With the current way we're spending money, this is how much we have currently in the permanent fund and in the CBR. So we have about $64 billion in the permanent fund currently, which is a good thing. Once again, we wouldn't have anything, I believe, if the people of Alaska did not put this in the Constitution. And this is why constitutional amendments, I think, are important. This is what's going to get you the permanent fiscal plan that was mentioned regarding the Chamber's priorities, too. If we had the appropriation limit in place, if we limited our spending to 2.5% a year, this is what the permanent fund would look like today, about over 100 and some billion dollars. Could have provided a POMV draw of about $6.2 billion. It probably would have been able to take care of our issues that we're talking about today in terms of maintaining the government spend at 2.5%, and we wouldn't be having this issue right now that we're discussing. But nonetheless, this is the current situation. Theoretically, if we had the 2.5% spend on an appropriation limit that we're advocating, we would have had more money in the permanent fund. Next slide, please. So this is status quo budgeting, meaning if we don't do anything different than what we're doing now, if we spend at the rate we're spending now, what happens is this. Within a few short years, this little purple here represents the PFD. The PFD under the POMV, SB 26, the $3 billion draw, the PFD will be gone and absorbed into state spend along with the rest of that POMV draw. So the idea, for example, that if we just use the PFD, because we're already using a part of the earnings under SB 26, but because we're growing at about 4 to 4.5% a year in our spend today, we're going to outstrip the ability for that formula to support that spend. And then what happens is we start to eat into the earnings reserve over time. And out about 2037, which is quite a distance out, we lose the earnings reserve at this rate. So then we're going to have to be looking at taxes. So it's the rate of spend right now, and has been for some time, that's really the enemy of a permanent fiscal plan. We can, I'm going to say easily, technically, we even have the money to solve this year's budget. We can solve it. We may even have some money, one-time money, to solve next year's budget. But we're doing a groundhog scenario every year. We're going back and doing the same thing over and over again, but we don't really have a permanent fiscal plan in place. It's just year by year by year. Next slide. This is what the earnings reserve would look like under the approach that we're advocating. It actually grows over time. The PFD stays as it has been for decades in the formula. And you have plenty of money in the earnings reserve to be able to help with the PFD, but also help pay for government. When you get out here pretty far, then we're projecting out to 2037, 2039. We may have to have a discussion if the rate of spend exceeds our ability here to service the spend under just the earnings reserve, because the earnings reserve formula, as we had put out, and we start drawing upon that a little more at that stage of the game. Next slide. So under the scenario we're looking at this year with no reduction in spend, we keep spending at the same amount of money. The PFD under SB 26 gets absorbed into the overall spend and disappears just in a few short years. Under the approach that we're advocating, based upon the slide before, the permanent fund dividend continues as it has. This right here, the reason the bars here are higher than the others is this is part of the payback that we're also advocating for. But nonetheless, you can see that the permanent fund dividend continues to exist as it has in the formula for decades. Next slide. Donna, you want to talk about this?
Yes, Governor. And you're going to be talking about the economy in Alaska and all of our desire to diversify the economy and bring in more revenues in the future. One of the things that we have to do is get our fiscal plan in order. This shows the GDP, economic growth of the state versus the rest of the country. The last time we balanced our budget was fiscal year 13. Since then, we've spent down $16 billion in our budget reserves to the point where we have about $2 billion left, which means to us that's the amount of money that we need to reserve for disasters and emergencies. So we've run out of savings over that time. But that savings being spent into the economy has not improved our economy. In fact, we're in the longest recession in the state's history. And compared to the rest of the country, which has come out of our national recession, Alaska is now 50th, dead last in economic growth, and we remain in a recession. So getting our fiscal house in order will actually help us improve our economy rather than trying to spend our way out of the recession, which clearly has not happened.
Thank you. Next slide. So we're going to talk about a couple of the major areas that we're looking at reductions, and just explain some of the math that we're seeing. So since the 90s, this is the marine highway system. Since the 90s, the ridership has dropped off by about 100,000 people. So folks riding the ferry has dropped off, some would say significantly. The fare box receipts that we received have also dropped off correspondingly. Yet we continue to subsidize the ferry system at a higher rate. So the question that we have, and we believe that we can make some of these runs more efficient. We'll probably have to divest ourselves of some runs. We'll probably have to change the schedule significantly. We have a consultant, we have an RFP going out for a consultant to really take a hard look at what this would look like under certain scenarios. But nonetheless, when you have decreasing ridership, decreasing fares, and increasing subsidies, it's not really a recipe for success. And so we believe that there would be folks that would come in from the private sector if they knew they were not competing against a government-subsidized transportation system. And most of these communities, not all, but most of these communities also have airports. And in talking with a lot of folks that live coastal area of Alaska, if you ask them if they would prefer to take a ferry from South Central Alaska to Dutch Harbor or fly, most people fly. The same with Southeast Alaska. So we're putting this out, and we have in our budget because we need to have a real deep, serious discussion as to what we want to continue to pay for, what we want to continue to subsidize, and are we getting the results or the outputs that we believe we should with regard to a service, a government program such as this. Next, please. This is the University of Alaska's spending. Donna, you want to talk about this for a moment?
Yes. So Alaska subsidizes university students more than twice the rate that other states do. The university doesn't raise outside revenues as other states and other land-grant universities do. So there's a big imbalance in the revenue and expenditure picture relative to universities around the country. In addition to that, there's a little picture at the bottom of the slide about our outcomes, which are lagging. This one just highlights graduation rates, but our outcomes are lagging other schools, other land-grant universities around the country. So we think we've given the university a challenge. We think that they can do better. We have pointed out that there are many bright spots in our universities, and there are colleges, community campuses that are delivering efficient education, but there are schools that have very, very high cost and are losing enrollment. So there are significant challenges there in terms of raising revenues as well as reducing their expenditures, perhaps not duplicating majors and consolidating some of the campuses.
And I think we're losing student, did you mention that? I think we're losing student enrollment too at the university. And just for the record, again, I got my master's from the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and I have one daughter who is double majoring in civil and mining engineering, and she'll be coming to Fairbanks from Anchorage this coming year, I believe. Next slide, please. This is Medicaid expansion. This is our projected spending on Medicaid claims. You can see that the growth of participants is increasing, some would say dramatically. This kicked in with Medicaid expansion under Governor Walker when he first came into office. This was one of his signature campaign promises. But in any event, you can see that the growth continues. But in our approach, we want to reduce the cost of health care, and we're having conversations. We've been in conversations. We continue to have conversations with the federal government. And Don, if you just want to mention, make a comment or two on that, please.
Yeah, so we're having very positive conversations with the federal government, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, CMS, about delivering services differently in Alaska. We have this expanded population, and as you can see, the growth in our costs are projected to be unaffordable. So we're talking with them about ways to deliver the service to all of those who are beneficiaries, but do it in a more efficient and effective way, perhaps through commercial insurance options and/or the exchange.
Okay. Thank you. Next slide. This slide represents some statistics on K-12 education. There has been a lot of discussion as to whether there have been increases put into K-12 in terms of funding, and as you can see on this particular chart, from 2003 to 2017, there is an incline in spend, not a decline in spend. So there is more money, and has been more money put into education almost every year from 2003. We had a dip here, slight dip there, but there continues to be more money put in. The outputs, I think, should be concerning to all of us. So you'll hear a lot of folks, and I'm sure there's folks in the room today that are fierce advocates of funding for K-12 education, and I understand that. But what was interesting to me was back in March, test scores came out from the federal government, the NAEP test scores. They're given every 2 years to grades 4 through 8 throughout the country. And Alaska got their scores back as well as the rest of the country. And Alaska ended up being dead last when it comes to reading for 4th graders, for example, and 8th graders. And what's the point in showing this? Is the point, and I have to clarify something, the point in showing this or demonstrating this, as well as the ferry system and Medicaid and the university, is not to disrespect the people that are working there. It's not to disrespect the efforts that they're putting in. But I think it is something we need to have, and that's a conversation about outputs. We fight very hard in Alaska, very hard for the inputs. And you can see that along with the ferry system, along with Medicaid expansion, we fight very hard for those inputs, and it works. When we fight very hard for something, we get the inputs. We have gotten more money. But we seem to fight less for the actual outputs is the issue. And this is a painful slide for me because, once again, my career has been K-12 education in the state of Alaska, both in rural Alaska and down in the Mat-Su. And the question we have before us is, does more money translate into better results? The answer is no. And it's simplistic. There's a lot of complicating factors. We understand that. But nonetheless, the point I'm trying to make is I think we need to start looking at and fighting just as hard for the outputs. When those scores came out in March, I can't recall one protest. I think there was one article in the paper, and that was it. But when it comes to funding, there's obviously a lot of energy being put into maintaining or increasing funding, and I understand that. But again, I think we have to have conversations along the lines of, can we do better in K-12 education in terms of our outputs, the ferry system, University of Alaska, our health care. That's what we're looking at. Those are the big drivers. And this is another case where the student population overall in the state of Alaska has been dropping over the past 20 years. There are some exceptions, like the Mat-Su, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, Lower Yukon School, or Yukon-Kuskokwim School District, and a couple other spots in the state. But generally speaking, the student populations are dropping, the funding is increasing, and as a system, not individual schools, because we do have some incredible schools performing really well individually, but as a system, according to the NAEP scores, Alaska's dead last. Next slide, please. So this is just basically summarizing some of the stuff we talked about. We have to, if we don't do anything, it's going to happen for us. It's just going to start to fall apart on its own. And again, Governor Walker tried to deal with it through a number of different taxes that the legislature rejected, and tried to deal with it with vetoing and trying to hang on to part of the permanent fund dividend in the earnings reserve. But nonetheless, we blew through probably in the last 4 years, how much?
14 billion.
How much?
14 billion.
$14 billion in savings in 4 years was used to fill that gap. We have $2 billion left, which means we have about 14 months left. If we don't do anything, then the CBR is gone. The SBR has about how much left in it?
170 million.
Yeah, and that'll probably be gone too within 15 months, 16 months. So then all we're left with at that point is the earnings reserve, and we demonstrate where under the POMV, under SB 26, at the rate of spend, that disappears as well. Next, not the earnings reserve, but the POMV draw. Before we go to the constitutional amendments, taxes. And I've got Bruce Tangeman here, Department of Revenue. We're doing modeling on taxes, both on the various different types of taxes and what they could, what income they can generate, what revenue they can generate for Alaska, sales tax, income tax, et cetera. But they're also doing some modeling on behaviors. In other words, if you implement this tax at this rate on this group, what happens? Does the group stay in Alaska? Do they pull back on spending? Do they invest differently? So we should have that in about, what, week and a half? Should be done. But this $1.6 billion gap, just to illustrate this, how much of a tax would we have to impose on every man, woman, and child from the second they're born to the second they die? Let's say 730,000 people.
About $2,300 each.
How about a working, estimating 300,000 people working, let's say? What would be the tax on a working individual?
Average would be about $5,300 each, continuing year after year and growing.
Tax burden in whatever form we would decide to do. So if you have a tax burden of $5,000 on a working individual and maybe $10,000 on a working couple, some would say those behaviors might, the behaviors might be that folks either change location, move out of state, do something differently. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they would want to stay and pay a $10,000 tax. We're trying to figure that out through our behavior modeling. We don't know the answer to that yet. Same with sales taxes, payroll taxes, et cetera. I called him Mario the other day because it was his father. What is his first name again?
Andrew.
Andrew Cuomo, New York State. Came out about 3 weeks ago, and he was decrying the fact that the millionaires in New York were leaving the state of New York. And he wasn't blaming them. He was actually questioning the tax regime that they have that was forcing that tax base to leave. Similar situations happening in New Jersey, similar situations happening in Illinois and other states that have high tax rates that are not broad-based but are narrow on the backs of certain income groups. And so we just have to be very careful what we do. We have to think this through. I know we're running out of time, but we want to make sure that we make the right decisions so we can get a permanent fiscal plan. So we talked about what was, where we're at now. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to talk about what I think will give us a permanent fiscal plan. Because without constitutional amendments, we do this every year. We come back to the same discussion every year. And the reason the constitutional amendments to me are important is this. I've heard a number of people say to me, and understandably so, it's a great discussion, Dunleavy, you guys were elected to go down to Juneau and make the hard decisions. Just make the hard decisions. Impose a tax, or take the PFD, or make the reductions. And I say, that's a very good point. There's only one problem with that. Alaska is only one of 24 states in the country that has embedded in its constitution a repeal and initiative process. 26 other states don't have that. So in those other states, you can force a tax on the people, and they will just have to accept it or leave the state. But in Alaska, if you don't like a law, you, the people of Alaska, can repeal that law. And we've had several laws repealed. I'll give you an example. This was not repealed by the people, but almost was. Your income tax in 1981 was going to go to the ballot. There was an initiative to repeal it. And everyone agreed at the time it was going to be repealed by the people of Alaska. But the legislature got ahead of it and repealed it. But it would have been repealed by Alaskans. Recently, in 2014, SB 21, the oil tax, that was put in place. That was up for a repeal. It failed, but nonetheless, the people of Alaska can repeal. And you can initiate laws as well. You can impose an income tax, if you wish, on the people of Alaska at the ballot. You can't determine where that money goes in the appropriation, but you can put an income tax in the ballot, and you can pass it. So what does this mean? It means that you guys are in charge at the end of the game, if you don't like what we put together. And the problem with that is, if we put something together, whether it's reductions, whether it's taxes, whether it is a PFD take, if you don't like it, and you go to the ballot, you could repeal what we've done. This continues that instability. So what we're advocating for is put on the ballot constitutional amendments in the front, and you guys would be the ones that vote on it. You'll vote on the constitutional amendments. You can either vote yes or no. So it's giving you the opportunity to decide if you want to front load the conversation on a permanent fiscal plan. let's go through the amendments. Go back to the little kid. Sorry, Jeremy. This is Jeremy's child. He too is wondering what we're going to do by the look on his face. But so he's building a sandcastle. And he's building a sandcastle at low tide. It's going to be a beautiful sandcastle. But the analogy is that's what we're going to do with the budget this year like we did last year. We can build something and put something together, but it's only temporary. It's only going to last for 1 year. The constitutional amendments will allow us to put something in place permanently, fix it in place permanently, and get the backing of the people of Alaska. Because, again, the only way we get a constitutional amendment change is that you folks vote on it. You folks help put together a permanent fiscal plan the way you want it to be put together. Next, please. So we're looking at 3 constitutional amendments. One is similar to the one on the books now, but as I mentioned earlier, the formulas were faulty. And the rate, the baseline spend, the incline was too high for it to really work. We'd have to spend about $9 billion. So we're proposing a spending, an appropriation, and a savings rule that would keep expenditures under control at around 2.5% a year. This would allow us to hem ourselves in so that when we come into another windfall potentially, through more oil production, more oil plays, could be other industries that we bring up to Alaska or revive industries like the timber industry, that money would then be saved for future generations. It could also be saved to be able to pay off bond debt for capital projects. There's a whole host of things we can do with it. So we're going to be asking the people of Alaska, do you want to hem us in on our spend so we're not spending more than 2.5% a year? By the way, from 07 to 13, the spend was about 15% a year. China has the hottest economy in the world at about 6%. They couldn't even keep up with that spend if we kept it going. We've dropped that spend over the last several years. It's about 4.5% per year now, but still, in our opinion, and the opinion of others, it's too high to maintain without continually adding money to it. And I think I may have mentioned this, if not, again, if we take the permanent fund or we take a tax, whatever it is, to fill that $1.6 billion, we can do that this year. But it grows every year 4 to 4.5%. So your tax burden will grow 4 to 4.5% a year to keep up with this incline of spend. That's why we want to get the incline of spend down. We can get this down again to 2.5%. We believe it gives the economy time to catch up, that we can get more investment in the state of Alaska, potentially bring more industries to the state of Alaska, and grow our wealth base. The next one is a vote of the people before any taxes are implemented. I think we should ask you before we reach into your pocket. Colorado does this with their tabor law. You can't tax in Colorado. It's been in the Constitution since the 90s. You cannot tax in Colorado unless the people agree to it, whether it's at the school district level, county level, city level, water district level, state level. Colorado, they just won't let you tax the legislature by Constitution unless they agree on it. So what's the economy of Colorado look like right now? It's the second hottest in the country. High-tech firms are flocking there. They have a housing shortage. People are going there. One of the reasons we believe, and with conversations from people from Colorado, is they don't have to worry about a predatory tax being put on them because they're hemmed in by the people. Because whether you're a Republican or Democrat in Colorado, most often you don't vote for taxes to increase. State of Washington, in a similar situation, they don't have an income tax because they don't believe they can get the support to do it. So they have a sales tax. There's other issues in Washington, too, that make it a great economy, cheap electricity, and access to the Pacific ports, et cetera. But nonetheless, we would ask you if you are interested in putting into the Constitution an amendment that would require us to work with you, the legislature to work with you, on any taxes in the future. Again, as part of building a permanent fiscal plan that won't get unraveled through the initiative process. This is front-loading it again. And finally, and I know this is contentious for a lot of folks, we believe that the PFD, the calculation, whatever it is, should not be changed unless you, the people of Alaska, vote to change it. Just like we put in the permanent fund, we believe that you should have a say on what happens to the calculation and the PFD. We believe it should stay the way it is, and under this amendment, it would stay the way it is. But if you wanted to change it, it could go out to a vote in the future to change it any way you want at the suggestion of the legislature. Next slides. And we're going to kind of go through this because this just gets a little wonky. I want to be able to have you guys ask some questions. But Jeremy, you want to do a yell out on this here? So in summary, real quick, this is both a budget plan and a permanent fiscal plan. The constitutional amendments, if voted in, will make it a permanent fiscal plan. We've been struggling with this for years, started under Governor Walker, but the habit of spending has gone back decades. It's just the nature of people. You look at the federal government, we have a $23 trillion debt that nobody really has figured out how we're going to deal with that. So what we're trying to do is, instead of taxing upfront, taking the PFD upfront, we're advocating absolutely steep reductions. And we know this is a painful process for a lot of folks. But we really believe if we can't close this gap and get this spend down to 2.5% instead of 4.5%, and if we don't hem ourselves in with constitutional amendments, history shows and demonstrates, especially in the state of Alaska, we come into a windfall or we come into another funding source, we're not going to save it. We're going to spend it. And so with that, I'll end up and we'll take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Because this room is not fantastic for acoustics, I'm going to ask people to raise their hand. I'll come to you, the microphone, to ask a question. Do we have any questions? I was going to say.
Can you explain, can you explain the philosophy of paying out the additional dividends that you're proposing this year
Yeah,
when we're trying to cut?
yeah, good question. Some of us view the permanent fund as a whole is separate from the state general fund, and the corporation is separate. It was isolated from politics. It throws off a dividend based upon investments in stocks, bonds, real estate, you name it. So it's its own corporation, spins off a dividend. So it's separate, in my opinion, and the opinion of others, many others in the state of Alaska, not everyone, that that's a whole separate calculation. It's really a transfer from our perspective, not an appropriation. And we know it's a philosophical difference, and that's how you couch the question. So philosophically, it's a transfer. It's divorced from the other spending from our perspective. And the people of Alaska, 600 and how many thousand? 660,000 applied or are eligible. They have an opportunity to use their money any way they want for any program they want, whether it's repair the car, pay for the house, etc.
We have two over here.
Hi, my name's Chris Villano. You know, I was thinking about my body as I get older, like I got a pain in my finger, probably have arthritis, but the rest of my body is working. I get sad when education is judged by one standardized test and a grade once a year. The rest, there are so many wonderful things going on in education in every classroom, in every school. And of course, we want student learning to increase. We need efficiencies. We need to support and retain great teachers. But it makes me sad that my leaders think our schools are failures. They are not. There might be an arthritis in a finger, but you have to look at the whole child from preschool to the university. And to say that our schools are failing, we always get better. I wished you all could come to my classroom. Each and every year, I tried to learn something new to give to the kids. But it breaks my heart to think that my leaders think our schools are complete failures based on the NAP test. I'm sorry. You have to be able to go out and see the schools and see that you should be proud and that, of course, will continue to improve reading score. My question is, do you think that stripping education funding will make our schools better?
It's a good question. And I certainly don't think all schools are failures. As I mentioned earlier, there are islands of brilliance. But when we look at the system as a whole, and I did say based upon that NAEP score, which compares students across the country, we are last. We can do better. I'd like to see us emphasize more K-3 reading outcomes, to be honest with you, in our schools, and also algebra by 9th grade. Algebra is a gatekeeper course. But do I think that by reducing money, it's going to help improve schools? We have a $1.6 billion deficit that we're dealing with. I don't necessarily think that more money is going to increase the outcomes. I think we see that now, and I'm just being honest and straight. I don't think we see that. I met with Apple here about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, because initiative through the Department of Labor and Department of Education, working with the federal departments as well in labor and education, we're heading towards setting up coding academies in the state of Alaska. We've got some grant money. And for example, coding academies, you don't need a high school diploma, you don't need a college diploma. You can get into a coding academy, and within 12 weeks, 15 weeks, you can get a certificate. And the Apple guys, once you get the certificate, they'll hire you at a $75,000 to $80,000 a year job, because this is the way of the future. So where I'm going with this is, I think if we emphasize our K-3 reading outcomes all over the state of Alaska, again, there are schools that are performing brilliantly. We should model those schools, but nonetheless, we need to have the discussion as to what are the important things, what are the important outcomes that we want. And I think most parents believe, I think most educators believe, that reading by 3rd grade is crucial, understanding algebra by the end of 8th grade is crucial, being proficient, because that's the gatekeeper course for all sciences. So I don't think all schools are failures, but I also don't think that more money is going to improve the situation unless we change some of our emphasis on what we want to see as outcomes.
Good morning. So I think that the state of Alaska has now seen your budget plan, and I'm wondering when we might get to see your governance plan. I think a lot of people here would agree that throwing money at a problem isn't going to fix it, but I think that same group of people is going to say that cutting money from that problem is also not going to fix it. So we've heard cut, cut, cut. When are we going to hear your fix plan?
Yeah, we're going to be coming out with an educational omnibus bill that we're working with folks on. Probably in about 2 weeks, we'll roll one out, in which we'll present some things that we could be doing differently for folks to take a look at. And that'll also garner another conversation as to where we want to go with education in the future. But that is one approach. As mentioned with the ferries, we have an RFP out for a consultant to really take a hard look at the different runs, the different schedules, et cetera. What are some things that we can do to make that ferry system much more efficient and increase the amount of money that the private fares or the fares could subsidize instead of just coming out of the general fund. So we are working on these things. The Medicaid we talked about, we've got folks back in Washington, D.C. We should be able to articulate a plan here probably in another, same thing, probably week, 2 weeks as well. I'm just saying, I'm not going to make an excuse. We just got into office December 4th. We stood up a government, and we're trying to deal with this issue. But and the House and the Senate, they're working through the issue too. So once their budgets are finished and they go through conference committee, we'll have a better idea as to what they're looking at, and then we have that conversation and how we end this, close this out. But again, the only thing I would caution you on is we can close this out this year, get through it. It's going to be like Groundhog Day unless we have, in my opinion, constitutional amendments, especially the appropriation limit and the savings rule, because if we don't, there's pressure to keep spending more and more. And if we don't have the investment in the economy to support that, then we're going to be in trouble. But no, I appreciate the question.
The vote on the permanent fund back in 1976 was featured in the election pamphlet. And briefly, the election part of it says that when oil and gas is depleted, where will the funds to feed our giant government come from? The answer, the permanent fund. The permanent fund diversified our economy to some extent. It was designed to fund the state government. When the oil was depleted, the oil is now running at about half of what it used to. and the price is down. Good time to use the permanent fund earnings, not the permanent fund itself, but the earnings. And when I get thinking about that, what I wonder about is how many of us Alaskans will have to leave to make this budget plan work?
I don't have the, I mean, that, I understand.
In the interest of time, I just want to point out, it is 9 o'clock. We advertised that this would go until 9 o'clock. So if you have other commitments and you need to leave, please don't feel uncomfortable about doing so. Governor,
leave it for
would you mind
we'll go back
taking 3 additional questions?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. And I already have those 3 people pointed out.
Yeah, Governor, I think great presentation. I'd like somebody on the panel to speak to the fact of how the amendments get passed. I don't think most people really understand the procedure. Where's the bottleneck? What can they do to help get that done if they agree? If they don't agree, think about it a little longer, then agree.
So AG, how do the amendments get passed? What's the process?
Well, there's two ways that the Alaska Constitution can be amended. One is through a constitutional convention. That's not the method that we're talking about. The legislature can pass a resolution to amend the Constitution. It takes a 2/3 vote in the legislature to do that. Once that resolution passes, and each of these amendments would have to pass individually on their own through the legislature, 2/3 vote on each one, and then they go to the people for a ratification vote at the next general election, simple majority vote of Alaskans.
Good morning, Governor Dunleavy.
Good morning.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Lael Oldmixon. I'm with the 529 plan, Alaska's 529 plan at the University of Alaska. I'm a parent. I have young children. They're in school. They're doing great. High achievers. I love their school. It's wonderful. I love this community. I love the, excuse me, North Star Borough School District, doing great things. What I'm concerned about is the overall health of our community. And I'm concerned about, like, from cradle to career and then on beyond that. And one of the things my daughter told me recently is she wants to be a doctor. Right? And the WWAMI program is something that is really attractive to me as a parent because I know that she could go through the University of Alaska and she could get a degree and then she could go on to the WWAMI program. But I heard you on the radio say it was a want for Alaska, not a need. But I disagree because I think we know medical care in Alaska is already weak and suffering because we don't attract as many doctors as we need in Alaska. And the WWAMI program has such a high success rate of keeping Alaskan doctors here in Alaska and encouraging Alaska youth to go through Alaska's higher ed system to come back and serve Alaska. But you said that was a failure and a want. So could you help me understand how you define want versus need for the state of Alaska? Because that to me felt like not really a clear want.
Sure, thank you for the question. So needs from our perspective, when you look at the Constitution, would be transportation, for example. Public safety would be a need. K-12 education is in the Constitution, that's a need. Management of our natural resources, these are all things in the Constitution. These are things that impact, when I talk about a need, when you're having a $1.6 billion budget deficit, the needs I'm referring to are services that impact the vast majority of Alaskans. Now, some would say that doctors and medical care also impact the vast majority of Alaskans, and they do. But when we're looking at services and programs, and we have to make decisions in terms of what services impact most Alaskans, we first go to the Constitution, we take a look at that, and then we look at, just generally speaking, how many of these services impact the majority of Alaskans. For example, and I don't want to take up much more time so you can have more questions here, but the permanent fund dividend, as we talked about, I view it as a transfer. But for those that view it as a program that could be eliminated, it's probably the one program that impacts more Alaskans than any other program. There are folks in rural Alaska that don't use the university. There are folks in Alaska that may not use roads. But that's one program that they do use, and they use it to feed themselves or repair a car or buy fuel oil. So when we're going through this, you asked the question, how do we determine what a need and a want is? Those services that impact most Alaskans on a broad scale is what we look at first. Does the WWAMI program not produce good doctors? Yeah, sure it does. Of course it does. But in a climate of a $1.6 billion persistent budget deficit, a structural deficit, and decisions have to be made, there'll be some programs that'll be funded and some programs that won't. You want me to give a summary? Oh, sorry.
I guess I'm the last question person. Can you hear? Oh, yeah,
Yes.
okay. Two things. One is I disagree with some of your statistics, and I would want to say that you're using averages are misleading for income tax. But my question has to do with good business practices require close monitoring of both revenue and expenses. And when expenses are higher than income, businesses must take a two-prong approach. We have to look at both revenue and we have to look at expenses. However, in the process, businesses have to be careful not to cut expenses that generate revenue. An expense example would be cutting matching funds to save money, yet matching funds produce a much higher return on investment than any stock market or any other investment. Why haven't you included ways to increase the state's revenue? And why are you proposing to cut matching funds that are instrumental in bringing funds to the state? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So again, we're dealing with a $1.6 billion deficit, and the revenue discussion has come up, and there's different points of view, different schools of economics on it, different philosophies. We believe that when you have a state that's in recession, lower 48 is booming. Unemployment rates in some states are 3%. The economies are hot. We believe that if we increase the burden on the private economy, that if we ask folks to give more in terms of taxes, and again, probably another week we'll have this study done. We want to take a look at the behaviors to see at what level of tax will this motivate people to change their behaviors. Either pull back on spending, for example, if it's a sales tax, or shop elsewhere, or if it comes to an income tax or some type of tax related to an income tax, will they get up and move and go somewhere else because of the costs? Your dollar, for example, in Idaho, which has taxes, may have taxes, there's no doubt about it. But your dollar in Idaho compared to Alaska, Idaho is still a cheaper state. Your dollar will go further, even with their taxes, because a lot of the other costs are lower in many of the lower 48 states. So long story short is, we believe that whether we tax the industries, whether we tax individuals, whether we take money out of this private economy that is still in recession, because the private sector has shed thousands and thousands of jobs over the last 4 years. Thousands of jobs have been shed. Businesses have closed down, restaurants have closed down, four-wheeler shops have closed down. We believe if you take the money out of that economy, or that sector of the economy, to support the government side of things, that you may have your tax base leave. And there is research and evidence for that happening in several states. So we're very concerned about that. And then again, the discussion has to be, if we look at something like an income tax, who gets taxed? What are the rates? Where are the exemptions? Because inevitably what happens is you narrow the base more and more and more and more. You have to increase it on the backs of a narrow few, whether it's industries or whatever. Eventually you get to a point that they will leave. Venezuela has more oil than any place on the face of the earth. Their country's falling apart for a whole host of policy reasons. Not that they've run out of oil, but policy reasons. And some have said, why don't you tax 20%, 30%, 40%? The more you tax, the more people and businesses are going to be giving up money. They're going to look elsewhere. I'll end it with this, because this is very important. I went to an investors conference in Houston, largest in the world. CERA Week it's called. Fantastic conference. If you get a chance to go there, you really want to go there, because it's cutting edge across the board on all kinds of topics. A lot of the investors love Alaska, and I asked why. And they said, things I didn't even think about. Your access to the Pacific. I said, why is that a big deal? Because the politics in the lower 48, some of the states are starting to close off access to ship, for example, oil and gas through their states. British Columbia is wrestling with this issue as well. That's why Alberta has been hemmed in, and they're having difficulty moving their products. They love Alaska because we have free access to the Pacific Ocean. They love Alaska because we have capacity in our pipeline. There's so much oil and gas down in the lower 48, they have no capacity. And so long story short, they're looking at all these things. They believe our geology is fantastic. The individual that cracked the Permian Basin, in which Texas is now producing 3.2 billion barrels per day of oil, he came to Alaska, has a little play on the haul road called Burgundy in the shale in Alaska, because all this oil in Prudhoe Bay came from somewhere. It's called source rock. It's the shale. He died last year, but we spoke with his partner that's very optimistic in Alaska, and they said we have billions upon billions upon billions of barrels of oil just from shale. So they're looking at investing because they're flush with money. But the one thing they did say is we're also reading the newspapers, and we're going to be very interested to see how you guys solve this fiscal issue so that there's stability and durability going out, because they have so many other opportunities to turn around and make quick money in other plays across the world. But they're very high in Alaska. They think there's some tremendous opportunities up here. They're just waiting for us to decide how we're going to fix this issue. I'd love this. We're going to do another one of these tonight. I'd love to stay with you and have conversation, but I want to thank you for the questions. I want to thank you for allowing us to speak with you today. And again, our plan is but one plan. The House and the Senate will come up with another approach to the budget. I would just leave you with one thought, though. Truly, if we don't have the ability to control our spending, at least through an appropriation and savings rule, we're going to be here every year, and it's going to cause instability every year. And so just like you to give that thought, you guys would be the ones that vote on it. You guys would decide what the future of Alaska is going to look like. So with that, I want to thank you.
Excuse me, Governor. I slipped in and asked for one comment. So first, I want to say I appreciate how you mentioned that you graduated from UAF, and with your endorsement that you're sending your daughter to UAF. So I kind of look at that as an endorsement of UAF over UAA. I too am a UAF grad.
She goes to both.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. I wanted to thank you, Governor, for coming, and of course your staff as well. And I accept a call to action where you talked about paying attention to outcomes. And I think that's an important message in what you talked about today, in addition to your endorsement of UAF, that really it's not just so much for your administration, but it's for residents, and particularly in the interior. So I'm glad to see a sellout crowd today. And I hope that for interior folks that we'll see more of our participation. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.